The time is now 5:04 p.m. Good evening and welcome everyone to the January 29th, 2025 Operations, Budget, and Fiscal Affairs Committee meeting. I'm Zakia Goins-McCants, newly appointed Chair of the Committee and District 8 Board Member. Welcome everyone to tonight's meeting. I'm honored to serve in this role and look forward to working with the committee as we discuss and aim to resolve the matters that affect our school system. Before we begin our discussions, I would like to take a moment to introduce our new committee members. First, we have our newly appointed Vice Chair, Mrs. Robin Brown, our District 5 Board Member. Uh, Mr. Jonathan Briggs, our Board Vice Chair and District 2 Board Member. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Felton Moss, our District 7 Board Member. Thank you all and welcome to the committee. Vice Chair Brown, would you like to make any remarks?
Let's get started, I guess.
Awesome. Mrs. Adley, please call the roll.
Mrs. Goins-McCants,
Present.
Mrs. Brown,
Present.
Mr. Briggs,
Present.
Dr. Moss,
Present.
Mr. Jackson. We have 4 present.
Thank you. With a quorum present, the Operations, Budget, and Fiscal Affairs Committee will come to order. First, we have item 1.3, adoption of the meeting agenda. Before we approve the agenda for this evening, the chair would like to add a new discussion item for tonight's meeting, a new time for our committee meetings. So the question is, shall the committee adopt the January 29, 2025 meeting agenda as amended? Any discussion? Seeing none. Mrs. Adley, please take a roll call vote.
Mrs. Goins-McCants,
Yes.
Mrs. Brown,
Aye.
Mr. Briggs,
Aye.
Dr. Moss,
Aye.
4 in the affirmative.
Thank you. There are 4 in the affirmative. The January 29, 2025 meeting agenda is adopted as amended. Next, if there are no corrections, the committee shall approve the December 11th, 2024 meeting minutes. There being no corrections, the December 11th, 2024 meeting minutes are approved. Moving on to item 2 on the agenda, public comment. There are no registered public comment speakers. So moving on to our new discussion item, the chair moves that the committee meeting start time be adjusted from 5 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Any discussion? Okay. Mrs. Adley, please call a roll call vote.
Mrs. Goins-McCants,
Aye.
Mrs. Brown,
Aye.
Mr. Briggs,
Aye.
Dr. Moss,
Aye.
4 in the affirmative.
Thank you. There are 4 in the affirmative. The motion to adjust the meeting start time from 5 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. is adopted. Moving on to item 3.0, we do not have any chief operating officer updates today. So we will move on to item 4.1, updated revenue projections based on the governor's budget and what does that mean for PGCPS. So the chair recognizes Ms. Lisa Howell, Chief Operations Officer, for the updated revenue projections based on the governor's budget, focusing on the impact for PGCPS.
Thank you, Board Chair Goins-McCants. Again, my name is Lisa Howell. I'm the Chief Financial Officer, and I'm joined here this evening with our Budget Director, Siobhan Smith. She's going to walk us through a high-level overview of the impact of the governor's budget that was released on January 15th. Before we jump into that, I wanted to, just for the sake of the community, for our board members, to remind everyone of where we are in the process. So when we develop our proposed budget for the current year, which begins in the fall, on the revenue assumptions, there's three primary factors that feeds into that: student count, per pupil amounts that we receive for those student counts, and then wealth equalization, which is basically part of the funding formula that helps to equally distribute or take into consideration the wealth of a county, which would determine how much the county has to pick up of their share of the funding versus the state. So when we developed our proposed budget for 2026, we already know what the per pupil amounts are because it's outlined in legislation through 2032. We have a pretty good idea of what our student counts were based off of our enrollment numbers that we had coming in for this past fall. Our total enrollment, which is the driver for our funding that we receive for every student, which is our foundation funding. And then on top of that, we receive targeted funding that's based on specific student demographics, including our multilingual learners, students with disabilities, as well as our students who are economically disadvantaged, often referred to as our farm students, which feeds into our compensatory education funding. So again, we had pretty good student counts going into the proposed budget. The wealth equalization or the wealth data for the county relative to the state, that information is not available until December. So at that point, our budget is already proposed. So we use some assumptions to keep that ratio between the county and the state pretty consistent with what it was in the previous year. So based off of that, we developed our proposed revenue for 2026, and that's what was reflected in the superintendent's proposed budget that was released in December. Now you fast forward to January, where the governor now releases his budget. At that point in time, we now have sort of certified and nailed down student count data. So there might be some slight adjustments for some of the targeted student populations. And we now have wealth data, not only for our county, but for all the other counties, which rolls up to the total wealth for the state. So that then adjusts the calculation of the funding. So what we're going to review today will be a comparison of the proposed revenue that we did during the fall, along with right now it's our drafted revenue, which will be included in the requested budget that will go to the county will vote on later on in December. And then on top of that, we've layered into it the proposed legislation that's currently in place, which is impacting the funding formulas for Blueprint. So for the community, there's 4 primary funding formulas. As I mentioned before, we get $1 for all of our students, and then we get additional targeted funding on top of that, depending on the student demographics. The funding for the other targeted streams is based off of the primary foundation funding formula. So one of the proposed changes, which Siobhan will go over in a little bit, is making a change to that primary funding stream, which is our foundation funding, which is now going to cascade down to the other funding streams. So what she's going to present will be the impact of those proposed changes and what that's going to look like to our revenue for 2026, potentially. So right now, as it stands, as we're preparing for the updated budget that will be presented to the board, that they will ultimately vote on in February, we call that our requested budget. That requested revenue is based off of current legislation, not proposed. Obviously, we need to be prepared for the legislation that could potentially change once you get through the spring General Assembly session. And we won't know that until the April-May timeframe. So until then, we're going to still present forward our requested budget based off of what we know is in current legislation, but need to be prepared to responding to that difference between what would happen if those reductions were to actually go through. So with that being said, I will hand it over to Director Siobhan Smith, and she will walk us through the impacts for 2026.
Thank you so much, Chief Howell. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see that.
Yep, you can see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so, sorry, I'm just trying to set it up. Okay, so as Chief Howell mentioned, I am going to walk us through the updates to the FY26 operating budget that is specifically pertaining to our revenue projections. So as Chief Howell mentioned, there are several legislation bills pending with the General Assembly right now. This slide outlines a few that could impact what we submit as the Board of Education FY26 requested budget. So I'm going to jump down to what I would call the good news story. Although the House Bill 0504 would be a welcome change, which would lift the OIC function entirely out of school's budget. Unfortunately, that impact is not enough to combat some of the other fiscal impacts of other proposed bills. So I don't know if when Superintendent walked us through his proposed budget back in December, he did mention the fact that the state of Maryland itself has a $3 billion deficit that will have to be closed. Part of that deficit and how they're going to address that deficit is outlined in some of these bills. One of the many ways that they're intending to close the deficit is to delay the collaborative time program until 2030. Collaborative time program is a plan to increase the amount of time teachers have outside the classroom to collaborate and learn. This delay would decrease expected per pupil revenue by $163 for foundation, which serves as the basis for many other blueprint programs. And we'll walk through that, what that exact impact will be in a second. Other key features of House Bill 0350 and Senate Bill 0319 include an increase to the local contributions towards retirement. The estimated impact for that is about $12.6 million, specifically for PGCPS. Another key piece of this legislation is altering the mandate for the state's share of the non-public placement program. The estimated fiscal impact that could potentially pass down either to the county or PGCPS is about $3.9 million. And then also pausing the growth in the concentration of poverty program for 2 years, starting with fiscal year 2027. And so once you kind of get an understanding of what's going on, that's what's sitting with the General Assembly right now that potentially will become law. You will start to see how that's going to impact our revenue. But before we talk about revenue, let's talk about enrollment. So just as a reminder, I know you guys hear us say this a lot. September 30th actual enrollment is the basis for our funding for the following fiscal year. So the enrollment for September 30th, 2024 will determine our funding for FY26. So we've updated the count to include final eligible enrollment. Please remember that to be eligible for state aid, the student must be a resident of the state, enrolled in the school system, present 1 day in the month of September, and have all appropriate vaccinations, or at least have a vaccination exemption in place by September 30th of the school year. So going back through it, the blue line is the final total eligible enrollment as of 9/30/2024, which increased slightly by about 7.5 students in the governor's budget. This change is mainly due to our increases to pre-K and seed school counts, as well as to our certified vaccination count. So we saw a couple of increases that we did not have in our proposed budget. Farm student count represented on the red line did not change from the proposed budget. So the count that we had in our proposed budget is the count that is in the governor's budget. And then our multilingual learner students population count shown on the green line and the special education student count captured on the purple line both increased by 3.7% and 1.4% respectively, compared to the counts that were in the proposed budget. So these increases may seem small, but they do make a great difference when they're multiplied by the per pupil amount for each program. So now that we kind of walk through enrollment, now we can talk about projected revenue. These projections are based on the preliminary state aid calculations that we received on January 17th. That is reflected in the FY26 requested column. And then as Chief Powell mentioned, we also added in financial impacts based on pending legislation, which is the FY26 requested pending legislation column. So here you can see the changes in total operating revenue based on state aid calculations that we received earlier this month. The state funding aid or the state aid funding is reflected in the requested column. That total funding that you would see increased from the proposed budget by $27.5 million or 0.9%. Although 14.5 million of this increase is attributed to restricted funds, the remaining 13 million would help close the $37 million budget gap we are already facing. However, if legislation passes based on the laws we kind of reviewed in the previous slide, we would see a total decrease in revenue of $11.7 million, which would further exacerbate our current deficit for FY26. As Chief Howe mentioned, we will submit a requested budget that outlines current law, but it is imperative for us to understand the pending laws and what that would mean for our budget. And then we would really implore board members to please keep this in mind when you're thinking about amendments. Amendments that are strictly increases to the budget will just further increase that deficit. So we will be looking for, if an amendment is to increase the budget, then we're going to be looking for offsets. Where would you like to cut in order for us to add? So a cost neutral amendment is greatly appreciated. Now we're just going to talk about unrestricted. Our unrestricted revenue is woefully impacted. They show the change between the preliminary state aid calculations and the proposed legislation in the General Assembly against our current proposed budget. Foundation revenue, which is our largest funding source, is relatively flat with just a 0.01% increase in the state aid calculation. And this is due, again, to the slight increase in the eligible enrollment that we talked about.
Can I pause you really quickly? Can we get
Sure.
a copy of this? It's not listed in board docs, but
Absolutely.
some of us are not blessed with perfect vision. And so you can kind of blow it up on the screen. It's a little bit small.
Is it small? Let me see if I can make it bigger. Let me see. Ooh, is that too big? Is that a little better? No,
That's a little bit better.
a little bit better. Okay.
Whenever we can get the presentation overall, sent so it can be added to board docs and us so that we can access it on our additional devices that we use to help us see all of the multiple screens, that would be really
Absolutely.
appreciated.
Sure. Okay, so I want to just point out the potential decrease in foundation by about $20.4 million, a decrease in compensatory education by about $11.8 million, and the decrease in comparable wage index by $1.2 million if pending legislation is passed. That decrease is slightly offset by increases in multilingual learners by about $5.7 million and special education by $2 million, which are also due to the increases in eligible state aid enrollments counts to these specific programs. So our good news story is if the preliminary state aid calculations become final as is, we will see an increase in our unrestricted revenue to again help offset the current budget gap, which is about $37.4 million. But the reality is that the state must also close its gap. And so therefore we need to be prepared that most likely some or all of the laws will be passed, and we're going to experience reductions in our funding, in our revenue. And what that would mean for us is an additional decrease of $25.7 million in unrestricted revenue that will have to be solved for. So that would total our deficit to about $63 million. And if that is the case, that could potentially mean cuts to school programs, hiring impacts, and a lot more. So I do think that really tough conversations would have to be had. So, we prepare for the worst and hope for the best. That's kind of the stance. So that's an update at a high level of our revenue projections based off of the information that we have at our disposal as of right now. We will continue to monitor what's going on in General Assembly. We will also continue to scour our budget and refine it as best as we can. But please let me know if you guys have any questions.
So just wanted to kind of jump in a little bit. Siobhan, if you can go back to the last slide. I
Yes.
just wanted to emphasize a couple of points. Number one, earlier she was reviewing enrollment and how that drives the funding that we have for these different programs, with Foundation being the largest funding program that we have, where we receive funding for every single eligible student within the school system. And I have to really emphasize that, because we're responsible and we educate all students who show up in our doors, whether they're immunized or not, whether they meet the eligibility criteria of the school system. We don't get funding, but we have to make sure that we're building a budget to cover the classrooms to support those students. So that's number one. So we're already in a bit of a gap as it relates to that, to making sure that we're providing services to cover all of our students. But number two, the blueprint funding programs outlined in legislation as it stands now has a component that's called minimum school funding, which essentially is outlining that at least 75% of the funding that we receive for these programs, so Foundation, compensatory education, multilingual learners, special ed, at least 75% of that funding is allocated to the schools. And so to the extent there's an impact where there's going to be a reduction to these funding programs, it's going to impact the school system as a whole, including our schools. So that is part of the challenge that we will be solving for. There's not a way to be able to close this gap without touching the schoolhouse, which is why there's a lot of advocacy, and we're encouraging our board members to continue to support this fight around the pause and the impact to the blueprint and the funding, because of the direct impact it will have to our students. We can't cut our way out of this through central office. There's not enough dollars in the central office to say, take all this cut out of our central office functions, especially when we have to send 75% of the funding following the student to the school. So if you cut it by 25 million, that's going to be a direct impact to our 200 schools across the district. Now, as we're obviously going to be working with our local government counterparts, they're feeling the impact of their own budget cuts as well outside of the school system, but budget cuts that will impact their county and their county agencies. But we'll certainly be looking for additional support to help keep the school system whole as it relates to any impacts around blueprint. We can't necessarily shift on a dime when it comes to the way in which we support and staff and provide resources for our schools. So this is a major impact that all of our LEAs are grappling with, and how we're going to be able to absorb these potential changes. But we're planning for it because of the reality of where we are right now in the budget deficit, starting at the state level, trickling down.
Thank you so much, Chief Howell. Dr. Moss?
Thank you all for pulling this together. Is there a way for you all to help me make sense of the potential 63 million across the board? I think, Siobhan, you cited that we could potentially lose 63 million Um, that's just not, I get where 11 million is coming from when we look at foundation. I get the potential around the 25 million in growth around unrestricted, but I can't make sense of this 63 million potential loss that we have. Um, and perhaps I need to see it pictorially, but can you voice over that again?
Sure. So there's a couple of factors. So we already, just in the proposed budget, before we even get into what you're looking at on the screen. So that $2.636 million that you see in the FY26 proposed column, built in that is already about $37 million that we have to solve for. Then when you layer on top of the pending legislation that adds an additional 25.7 deficit, that when you compound the both, when you add the two together, that's what's leading to the larger deficit of about $63 million, if that makes sense.
And just to add to that, so in our 25 budget cycle, there was around, I'm going to round up to say $80 million in energy and telecom revenue that was part of an ongoing funding stream that was provided to the school system from the county as part of the county contribution. That was above and beyond the minimum required to blueprint. In the 25 budget, that funding stream was cut. And so to get through the 25 budgeting process, we were able to go through, identify reductions in order to deal with the impact of that lost revenue. And then we also implemented other changes for 2025, but we're still going through the process of resetting our budget. When you lose that much of a large funding stream, it takes some time to literally reset your budget when you lose that much in revenue that impacts your district across the board. So when we developed the budget for 26, we had our revenue, we were able to, and then we identified all of our ongoing costs of just keeping our doors open. One of the largest impacts is around our negotiated agreements. So compensation, maintenance. We had some costs in there for just, the higher cost of just doing the same things that we still continue to do. Textbooks. When you just consider kind of the basics, there was a gap between our revenue we had for 26 and our projected expenditures for 26. And so we were able to go through and initially identify cuts to close that gap a little bit. Once we were done with that, there was still a gap of around $37 million. So we're still going through that process of closing that gap, which is tied to resetting of our budget for 26, resulting from that lost revenue stream from 2025.
Yeah, if you all could just, before you send these slides over, it would help if you could make sense of the whole 63 million on one slide. I think that would be helpful for me and for the public in general.
Sure, we can absolutely provide that.
Committee Vice Chair Brown.
Thank you. I had a quick question. First of all, thank you, ladies, for answering the questions and for having a bit more insight. It made sense to me once you guys explained the deficit. My question wasn't particularly to farm students. I noticed that there was a significant jump from it was almost 20,000 additional students that switched over to become farm students. And with the significant jump, I know that there is essentially funding that is allocated for that. Can you all speak to what that looks like for PGCPS and if that funding will kind of close the deficit? Because I'm trying to figure out and understand how, obviously, you all said that there's components when it comes to us getting funding. And one of the components was farm students. So what does that look like when there is a significant jump of farm students? Does that mean we get more money? Does that close the foundation gap? Can you kind of explain to that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, so Siobhan, if you can go back to slide 3, just so we have that up while we're sort of talking through the change in student count. So what you're looking at here is student count over several fiscal years, 5 fiscal years, going back to fiscal year 2022, which is based off of 9/30/2020 student enrollment. So again, you're always using the enrollment for the year before to project revenue for the coming year. And so when you look at that red line, you can see that there was a substantial jump in our student count after the pandemic years in 2021, 9/30/2021, up to 9/30/2022. And that's where you saw that huge increase. And there was a correlating increase in our compensatory education revenue for that fiscal year. And that is in addition to the foundation revenue that is based off of the total eligible enrollment as well. So, but then now as you continue on from fiscal year 2024 through the fiscal year 26 planning cycle, you can see that compensatory education enrollment or FARMS student count has leveled off. It's been pretty consistent around 85, 86,000 students for the last 2-3 years. So we did have that one spike between fiscal year 23 and 24, but since then it has leveled out. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Briggs.
Thank you so much, Chair Goins McCants, and thank you so much for the presentation, Ms. Smith and Ms. Howe. And I want to apologize for background noise if you can hear it. Don't think you can. Okay, I don't see any hits. So I wanted to just say that one, I appreciate this, and I feel like all of this makes sense because I've kind of been keeping track of what's happening at the state level. Obviously, the budget we get each year, and so I try to read through all of that. So all of this makes sense for me. And the thing I would like to see, and then I'm curious to know one, you all's perspective, but two, I think as we're looking 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, is and I'm going to use this term realizing that I feel like at this moment in time it's probably kind of going to stir up some or trigger some folks, but efficiency and how we could really try to get ahead of some of these things. So I think like there's likely going to be, and I know this happens to organizations all the time where they have to downsize. Something happens, right, where you had intended for specific revenue sources to come and they didn't, whether it's like grant funding or private funding or public funding. So that happens. But I think one of the things that really is effective for organizations is when they have a good line of sight and understanding of the departments where we can make this cut and this won't, majorly impact the work that we do, right? These are areas where we're efficient, where things are working well. And these are the areas where maybe we could, go without and be completely fine. I think households have to do this all the time too. You're just going to have some downturn sometimes. And so I feel like across all of the different departments, it would be really nice to know, like, what are those things, what are those specific targeted questions when we're looking at it from the lens of efficiency and high impact in systems level, what's working well and what are the things that we're like, we may be able to cut and this won't significantly impact the work that we do. And ideally we wouldn't want to make those cuts, but if we did make the cuts, we'll still run at a high, efficiency level. And so I'm wondering if like that is like a part two to this is really identifying that. And then I guess the question I had for the both of you is like, do we need a staff member who can like look across all those departments, who can try to coordinate like what the data that we have here with like what's happening there so that we have a kind of a proposal, whether legislation passes or not, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop talking and see if there's any comments.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. When you have an organization of this size, it is extremely complex to work through all those issues that you mentioned. I guess I keep talking, or am I out of time?
You can use my 2.5 minutes to give your answer.
Okay, thank you. So when you think about the way in which kind of where our costs go, the majority of our costs are people costs, and the majority of the costs are in the schools. And our schools are there to, class sizes and, outside of classroom supports, all of those different types of efforts. When you consider what we went through with the pandemic and how that shifted and changed how we deliver education, that has also added an additional layer when we're looking at efficiencies. We had additional outside funding to help support some of those additional efforts we didn't have previously, one-to-one devices, increased mental health supports, different, enhancements to try to help with academic outcomes. And so we really shifted and changed the way in which we were delivering instruction. And now with those extra dollars going, it required us to then reevaluate what we already have in our base that maybe is not as efficient, so we can now absorb the impact of what we need to continue to do that is necessary. The level of mental health supports that we're providing now is substantially greater than what we had before. So in order to fit it into the budget, you're making those trade-offs to determine how you want to be able to invest those dollars. You're looking at the time that you're spending, the time, the energy, the funding that's available and set aside for summer school to determine if those academic interventions during the year makes more sense in terms of the return on investment, and the time in which you have with the students is longer, obviously, during the school year versus, 2.5 weeks during the summer months. So as we're going through this process of having to reset our budget, we're juggling both initiatives, both challenges, which is how do we absorb some of those additional responsibilities and costs tied to educating our students differently now than we had to before, while at the same time looking at how do we consider those opportunities for efficiencies or reevaluating programs and services to see which ones may need to be reprioritized, considering the overall objectives and goals of the school district. So it is an ongoing exercise. It's not something you just do in a matter of, a few weeks. It really takes time. And that's what we've been going through really since the last budget cycle, when we're looking to reset our budget, because we have to reevaluate how can we do things differently with a lower cost point. And then also realizing where we may have opportunities to refine some of our assumptions around uh, uh, sort of the budget factors that goes into developing a budget. So as an example, we look at our fill rate for positions, and we look at our vacancy rate, and we look at salary lapse that can result from a lot of different reasons, and really trying to fine tune that to determine, is there an opportunity to whittle that down even further or to refine that even further. And there's a lot of different reasons that can result in salary lapse. It's not always about vacant positions. There's other factors that drives into that as well. So looking to see, okay, when we have that lapse, what are some of the drivers of that? And then how do we maybe refine those factors even further to make sure that we're squeezing out every dollar that we can, so we don't have a missed opportunity to reallocate those dollars for another priority in the current year's budget. So as we're going through 26, it is the lean and mighty team of the budget office, the CFO, looking at the budget across the board, working with all of our division chiefs across the board, and having these conversations about how we're going to reprioritize our spending dollars to be able to close the budget gap.
Thank you so much, Chief Howell. I do not see any more hands raised. Oh, there we go. Vice Chair Briggs.
Okay, well, I just had one other question for Chief Howell, and I want to say thank you so much for that reply, and it really answered a lot of the questions that I was kind of lingering on. The one question I did have for you, and hopefully also I just want to acknowledge just the kind of to your point, the scale of work that needs to be done. Hopefully my tone isn't coming off as condescending, that like this will be something that'll be a quick turnaround. And so I'm thinking with this staff position, I'm hoping really the question is like, should we be looking at a consultancy company that could, I know that that's like making an investment on the front end, but hopefully it'll have a kind of a longer term impact for us. Is there someone, or is there a FTE role that could kind of help with this? Do you have any advice or pointers, or you obviously are the leader of this, so like, do you think that would be something that would help the office in any way and would be necessary?
Yeah, I mean, always having outside support to help with an effort and initiative like this, where they're laser focused on this effort, can always certainly be a benefit. We have been partnering through the AIB using a resource allocation partner that is helping us with the funding requirements around Blueprint, which I said the funding follows the student, but then also making sure that we're balancing out that allocation among our schools. And so that may require reallocation of funding that we already have in a different direction. So we have been leveraging that partner a little bit, but that's more strategic and more aligned to the Blueprint specifically, not necessarily to, hey, where are there opportunities to potentially be able to optimize the budget that we do have in order to close a budget gap. Now, I will say within the different divisions, we have hired, as you know, different consultants to help with operational efficiencies. Like we have a whole transportation audit that took place. And so that's its own separate work stream. And human resources has also gone through sort of an outside consultancy to look at how to streamline the work of the human resources division and the staffing component as well. So to a certain extent, some of that work has already begun, depending on the specific nature of that particular area. But certainly just thinking about it holistically for the whole district, specifically for a school system, having that level of expertise and consultancy could certainly be a benefit.
Yeah, my thought is the last thing I'll say in the 7 seconds is like the person who would really be able to look across departments. So they would probably work in your office, but they'd look across all of those and do that like heavy lifting over time. That's it.
Thank you, Vice Chair Briggs. Dr. Moss?
Yeah, I think I certainly want to build on Vice Chair Briggs's assertion here around um, I'm not going to use the word he used. It scares me in this climate and context, but I will say we keep talking about this deficit that we're rolling over of 37. I would like to see a set of recommendations for how we clean that up. I don't know that I've seen that. And so as we layer this part of the work on top of our budget work, at some point we've got to reconcile the 37. Now, I, I, I can't even imagine that I'm saying this as someone who certainly believes in Thornton Commission's work, that we've been grossly underfunded. So I want to hang all that on top of what I just said, because it's a nightmare that we even have to do this work. But I think at some point, we've got to stop talking about the deficit and propose, right? Um, Ways to consolidate and do this work in a powerful way where our kids still don't miss good learning experiences. So is there any effort by your department to start saying this is how we make up the 37? We've got another 11 coming, but this 37 is still resting here, irrespective of if we get level funding from last year, I think the 37 still remains. So are there a set of proposals and recommendations around how we clean that up? Or do we actually go into um, our existing rainy day fund and keep moving as we do? Have we made it there yet?
We are still working through that. My team, along with the divisions, have been going through and identifying where there may be opportunities to be able to close that budget gap. So it's not something that we're outlining publicly yet, but that work has been ongoing since the fall of how we're going to be able to get there. And then, sort of balancing out the pros and cons of which lever do we pull in order to close that gap. I think Superintendent outlined it the best in the very beginning that, everything is on the table. And we really have to look at the work that we're doing, how we're doing that work, the best bang for our buck for our students to make sure that as we're prioritizing those decisions, that aligns with the goals of, the primary focus areas of the superintendent and the overall strategic goals of the school system, that we're making those informed decisions to kind of get to that point where we're making those tough calls about how we're going to have to close that gap. But we do have options that we have been evaluating, and it's just getting to the point of making final decisions or coming up with recommendations on how to be able to get there. And I do want to just make one last point. I know I'm a little over time, that the rainy day fund is not something that we would tap into to close a budget gap because it has to be sustainable. So we are looking at operationally, what do we need to do different, because we have to be able to sustain this on a going forward basis.
Um, with that, I want to make sure that we have time. If there's anything that we have not explicitly asked, either Chief Howell or Director Smith, that you think it's important for this body to know in this last 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
I think the main point that I want to be able to drive home is the budgeting process, and this is an iterative process, for several months to come. We're dealing with what we know about now, but we're getting fiscal notes, proposed legislation, proposed bills every day that we're being asked to evaluate, to review, to determine what the impact would be for the school district. We have that component going on. We're going to be going through the amendment process with the board members. And then still this lingering question around what's going to happen to our revenues. not to even get into what's happening at the federal level, which that's kind of a back and forth. So there's a lot of uncertainty around there in terms of our top line of what's going to come down to us. But on the expenditure side, even when we're looking at what we already know we have to deal with within our own base budget, we always have to deal with legislation and those changes that are coming through. And so my team and the division, the district across the board, as we're getting these bills to evaluate what would this mean to the school system, I know we're all taking a really hard and close look about what this would mean operationally, but also from a fiscal impact as well, because oftentimes these mandates are unfunded. And so we want to be very careful that as we're going through this budget season, which is extremely tight, and legislatures are still pushing for changes and wanting to make recommendations to current law that can have a real financial impact to us, that our board members, our community understands what that means for the school system, and everyone is advocating and speaking that voice on our behalf. It's really challenging because those bills are coming fast and furious every other day. So it's difficult to be able to kind of keep a running tab of if all these things were to happen, what would be the impact to us? But I know that's always a part of the challenge that we face during this time of year. But during a budget cycle where it's extremely tight, it's just another layer of complexity.
Thank you so much, Chief Howell, um, as well as Director Smith. At this point, we will move on to item 4.3, our, oh, my apologies, 4.2, our amendment process overview. Chief Howell, is that you again?
That is actually Siobhan.
So I don't have, I think we did the amendment process overview in the last OBAFA meeting. If you want, I can bring that presentation up and we can go over it again, or at a high level, I can just speak to it. However you would like. If you have a preference.
If you'd like to speak to it at a high level, that would be sufficient.
Okay, so thank you so much. So hopefully you guys are working on your amendments based off of the superintendent's proposed budget and conversations and discussions that you may have with your constituents, that you have with the administration. Because of the structure of how the work sessions were scheduled, amendments are due no later than the 10th, but we do highly encourage all board members, if you have amendments ready now, please submit so that the administration can have as much time as possible to respond to it. That will help keep the flow of conversation, especially in the next OBAFA meeting. It will help keep it more effective, keep it fluid, where you already have the administration's response and we can talk about it. Once we receive the amendments, not only does the administration respond, but the budget office, we do a review, make sure we cross it out. And then what will happen is during that final work session number 3, which I believe is scheduled for the 13th of February. Prior to that, the OBAFA meeting, which I believe is scheduled for the 12th, so the night before, all of the amendments will be presented the BAFA meeting for you guys to discuss, review, and figure out which ones do you want to move ahead to the full board. In the past, there's been, sometimes board members have similar thought processes, and so sometimes we get duplicative amendments that could be co-sponsored instead of having 2 separate. We could have 1, and so hopefully we can flush all of that out. If not prior to submission, but at least during the OBAFA meeting the night before, so that when it gets to the full board during the 3rd work session, it's a more fruitful conversation about those amendments that you think are really, really, really going to have an impact. And then on that 3rd work session, February 13th, that's when the board will vote on the amendments that will be incorporated into the requested budget cycle. At that point, then myself, my team, Chief Howe, we will have to work it into especially if, again, we receive amendments that require increases to the budget and there's no proposed offsets, that then we have to find the offset because our revenue is our revenue, right? And so as our budgeted expenditures increase and our revenue is where it is, it leaves us with no room. So that process, we need to get that done because what will happen is during the full board meeting on February 27th, the board will be looking to adopt the FY26 requested budget at that time for then transmission to the county by March 1st. So we have very compressed schedule to do a lot of work in a limited amount of time. The amendment template, hopefully you guys all have it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Hopefully it's pretty intuitive. I did walk, and I don't know if all of you were present. So again, if you need a walkthrough or if you need a demo of the amendments template, please just let me know. There's also the video from the December OBAFA meeting, excuse me, where I walked you through the template. But once we receive that template, then there's a lot of work that we have to do on our end to make sure that it's ready for you in time for OBAFA, in time for the work session number 3, and then incorporated into the budget in time for the board meeting on the 27th. So please just let me know if you guys have any questions specifically about the amendment process.
Just wanted to add to that, the importance of the February 12th OBAFA meeting, because that really is the opportunity to collectively have dialogue between board members who are proposing the amendments. Maybe they have questions about amendments the colleagues have put forward, but also to be able to have a response from administration to really understand the impact of what the amendment may actually be, to see if there's that work that's already taking place, or to help collectively discover or determine if there's a way to self-fund the request. You may recall in looking at the superintendent's budget this past proposed cycle, there was not a lot of enhancements because the directive to the divisions is you need to find it within your own division. So if you want to add something in there, we talked about efficiency and sort of reevaluating your base, go back to your base to determine where maybe you have positions or resources that you utilize that you now can or should be repurposing for something different. And so there was not a lot of incremental enhancements that were added to the budget because they were tasked with being able to figure it out within the budget allotment they already had. So we're taking that same approach as we're going into the amendment discussion. So to me, the way I see that February 12th meeting is really an opportunity to say, okay, we really think meaning I'm speaking on behalf of board members, if you have an amendment and you really feel passionate that this is something where there's a gap that's needed, let's kind of maybe talk through to see how we can self-fund this request so it's not additive to the budget, it's not additive to the deficit that we're already trying to close. And so it's important for us to have an idea of what those amendments are going to be to make sure the right members from administration are at that OBAFA meeting to be able to have this discussion and dialogue.
Thank you so much, Chief Howe and Director Smith. Vice Chair Brown?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that I said this for the public to hear. Director Siobhan Smith was extremely helpful in kind of guiding me because I did watch the December 11th OBAFA meeting. It is very user-friendly, and if you guys, seriously, just because this is a new board, I know we are learning new things, but it is extremely user-friendly, and it is a great opportunity for us to kind of give our voice and kind of also try to understand exactly how it works. So I know looking at the document might kind of seem overwhelming at first, but the Director Smith was very, very helpful. And so I just kind of want to make sure that I give that piggyback for any of the new board members like myself who needs additional support when filling out the amendment process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Moss?
I didn't get to say this earlier, but I do appreciate you all's work on this. I couldn't imagine doing your jobs. And so I just want to appreciate, I know all of my questions sometimes feel like they come out of left field. So I appreciate you always being prepared to answer them too. So just thank you for your work. I just want to thank you in advance of an even tougher season. So I just want to make sure I make space for that. Thank y'all. And thank you for this. The documents you developed was certainly helpful. The video presentation last time was super helpful. So, but I appreciate the high level overview today.
Thank you.
Seeing no more questions, our last agenda item is 4.3 for the budget work session overview and follow-ups. Chief Howell, that is you again.
All right, so I think just sort of recap what was previously shared. So we are going to be approaching our second work session on February 6th. And that is where we will have the second half of the district's leaders available to respond to questions around what's in the proposed budget, which will hopefully help with understanding and perhaps giving some insight into potential amendments board members may want to make, or just for community members at large to understand what is in the proposed budget. Coming out of that, as Director Smith mentioned earlier, the board amendments are due February 10th. And so between that February 10th timeframe, the OBAFA meeting, we will then be working feverishly towards the third and final work session. And the primary focus of that third work session is for the board to decide which amendments should be included in the requested budget. So that really will be the primary focus. So whatever time is needed between now and then to have your questions answered. I know there were rapid fire follow-up questions coming out of the first work session. So hopefully we're capturing those. I've seen some come through the board tracker. I've seen some of those come through. I think they're coming through another format to make sure we have a chance to respond to those. But then we have the second session coming up on the 6th. But we want to make sure that we're answering the questions so you have the insight, the information that you need to assist you as we're nearing towards the final and third work session, which is to kind of finalize decisions around the amendments to be included in the final proposed budget on the 27th. So between that third work session, which is really key for us, on the 13th, we essentially have a week to then come up with the requested budget, which will include, again, any final tweaks to the revenue, along with any adjustments to our expenditures, having a balanced budget. So whatever gap we have going into it, that will be finalized in that week. So we can then get the information shared and posted for the public on board docs by the 20th in preparation for the meeting on the 27th. So it really is a short turnaround with all these different data points, but that is what we're working towards for the next 2 work sessions.
Board members, do we have any questions? Yes, Board Member Brown.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I forgot to ask this while you all were doing the presentation. Did we take into consideration the survey that was done by constituents when it came to the budgets and the recommendations?
Thank you. That's a great question. And it's really a question that kind of goes to our overall process. And we've had some conversations around the timing of all the work that we do collectively to make sure that we're gaining community members' feedback into the budgeting process. So certainly, as you know, throughout the year, superintendent, division chiefs, we're hearing feedback from board members, from constituents, that feeds into the budget formulation process that occurs in the fall. And that survey is certainly a part of that process as well. Now, granted, the timing of it doesn't always align perfectly, but I think that's the opportunity around the potential timeframe during the amendments, that if there's something that really resonates or came through in the survey from community members that may not have already been considered in the proposed budget, that there would be an opportunity to make some adjustments based off of that information that's coming out of the survey. But many of the key focus areas and priorities that the superintendent outlined also speaks to many of the concerns and feedback that we heard from community members, whether it's transportation, special education, supporting our students, multilingual learners. So I think there's alignment already, but there's certainly an opportunity to still consider that feedback into this process, even for the remaining board meetings that we have, whether it's an ABAFA meeting, where there's an opportunity for public comments, and then our normal board meetings, where there's an opportunity for public comments. All that feedback can come into the budgeting process to say like, perhaps this is something we need to look at, or maybe the dollars are in the budget. We just need to reevaluate how they're being utilized to maybe address something that wasn't previously considered. So certainly it's important for the public to continue to be engaged in all aspects of the budgeting process through the public comments. I would encourage them to certainly do so, and to also reach out to the board members, and they will be sure to get that feedback to administration as well.
Thank you.
Are there any additional board member questions around the process? Seeing none. Thank you all so much for this presentation and for answering all of our questions. And I know our sometimes it can come across as a bit hostile, but please know it's coming from a place of really trying to learn and get to the bottom of how we can best handle this deficit for our constituents. With that, the chair informs the public that our next virtual Operations, Budget, and Fiscal Affairs Committee meeting will be on February 12th, 2025 at 5:30. Please continue to check the Prince George's County Board of Education website for meeting information and updates. Thank you all for the great discussions, attendance, and again, for all of your help in explaining these things to us. To our viewers, thank you for watching. There being no further business, the time is now 6:06 p.m. and the January 29th, 2025 Operations, Budget, and Fiscal Affairs Committee meeting is adjourned.